If Russians threaten blackouts, for example, in the capital of Ukraine, then the Kremlin should know there will be blackouts. In the capital of Russia, in Moscow, for Volodymyr Zelensky. In Belgorod, there is also no water supply, and Neptune missiles attacked the Karachevsky electrical plant. A fire broke out in Bryansk region, according to Russian social media channels.
They're getting wrecked, bastard. Yeah, no way. Yeah, we hit it. That's something. The armed
Forces of Ukraine destroyed an enemy helicopter. Mi-28 FPV drones Zail Madyar. But Ukrainian drones are also turning Russia's oil and gas empire into a hellish chain, writes The Sun. What the hell is this?
bastard. Bring the heat over here right now, damn it.
There is still a fuel crisis in Crimea.
I got the car, but basically, they only have 95 there because the other fuels are only available if you have coupons. So, unless you have those coupons, you can't get any of the other fuel options. We're standing in line like in the USSR.
And there are no more safe zones in Russia? Keith Kellogg confirmed that Donald Trump gave permission to strike Russian territory with American and European weapons. As I understand it, this is official. We're waiting for the Tomahawk.
Alright, that's a train.
Thief!
Under the locomotive.
We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health. Roman.
Grigorievich, what do you think about the situation in Belgorod? There's no water or electricity, and that's all because we attacked the power plant. What do you think?
There's no water because there's no electricity. The pumps run on electricity, of course. If the power goes out, the pumps stop working too. Some water still comes out, but after that, naturally, until they restart generation, there won't be any. And for the Russians, it's actually built in a rather complicated way, or rather, it's complicated to listen to. They don't have a networked system like we do. For us, you can knock out several lines and there will still be electricity because the supply comes in from at least 3 directions. But for the Russians, it's linear. If you cut off a line, everything connected to that line shuts down and waits until that line is restored. So their system is quite problematic. Well, given the size of their territory, it couldn't really be any other way. Russia covers 17 million square kilometers. Obviously, only linear structures can exist there. But that's exactly what we're taking advantage of. We've talked about this so many times, right? To take down the Russian energy sector and economy, which is entirely dependent on energy. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. If you knock out the main generating facilities and the power lines that supply consumers, again, these are linear power lines, then knowing the structure, you can actually do it. The entire Russian economy would collapse, not just the refineries, that is not just the oil processing plants. Oil transportation is almost entirely dependent on electric pumps. They've switched over, they're noisy. We're a bit behind in that regard. We still pump gas using gas itself. Sometimes as much as 7 billion cubic meters of gas are burned just to pump several tens of billions of cubic meters. Well, that's just how gas pumps work. So basically they consume their own gas, as it's called. But the Russians have switched to electricity. Now, if you shut off the electric pump, everything will come to a halt. That's what they've started focusing on now, our long-range strike capabilities. And you can see from the footage that some serious munitions have arrived. So it could be from a HIMARS fired by an attack MS, specifically the 100-mile or the 300-kilometer version. It could also be our own missiles, the ones that have been announced, re-announced, and finally over-announced about 300 times by now. Well, that possibility exists. These announcers are already getting on my nerves, honestly. You could break your tongue with all their announcements, with all their teasers, videos, and mumbling. So we do have this problem. At least for now, there's still a shortage of actual missiles. Well, I mean, real ones with long range. At the very least, you could say we can operate in the near abroad. It's 80 kilometers to Belgorod. Basically, a 100-kilometer range missile is enough to accomplish a combat mission. That's why this is probably the beginning of blackouts all over Russia. Why Belgorod? Well, it's the closest regional center to us. That is, Belgorod is the first one within reach, then Kursk. Next will be Kursk, as I understand it, then Bryansk, after that Voronezh and Rostov. We'll see based on the range of the weapons used.
Roman Igorovich, there have been 2 statements. The first one, Kitkov stated that Trump agreed to let us use American weapons to strike deep into Russian territory, that there are no restrictions or limitations on range, and so on. That's not true. After that, Zelensky said, we will strike Moscow and there will be a blackout in Moscow too. The Kremlin should get ready. How do you assess these two statements?
Well, so far, apart from slingshots, the Americans haven't given us anything. And they said, go ahead, hit Russia, here's 1,000 slingshots, go ahead and fire as much as you can. Well, we tried with slingshots, but they don't reach Moscow. It's 500 kilometers to Moscow. To hit Moscow, even with a simple cruise missile for starters, well, it might just not break through. At the very least, you need a ballistic missile for that. If, say, Kellogg or Trump, or now Vance, who's also starting to echo Trump, if they gave us, for our HIMARS, those launches, the ATACMS or PRSM missiles, as they're also called, with a range of 500 kilometers, those would land right on the Kremlin. If they had handed them over and allowed it, then by all means, take them as a generous gift and fire wherever you want. In that case, Moscow would already be gone. But most likely, so far, they've only given us slingshots. And they're trying to show off, saying, we allow you to strike Russian crows over Russian fields. Well, obviously, that's sarcasm, but that's how it looks for now. They're just showing off for now. There are no missiles. The missiles we still have left from previous years, so to speak, the ones we were supplied with, well, those are AT-CMS. There are cluster ATACMS, there are 300-kilometer ones, but not in the reserve stock. So if there are, say, 15 or 20 of them, that's the untouchable reserve. It's unlikely anyone will use them unless we're 100% sure they'll be replenished for us at the very least. So for now, it's all just for show. Big American showmanship, you could say. They showed off, demonstrated their own vision of how things might proceed. Let's talk after something actually happens. Because, say, if a cruise missile enters Russia, a Tomahawk, an AGM-158 JASSM, if they give those missiles to the F-16S, the Russians will immediately copy it and make a huge fuss about it. They'll claim that Americans using Ukrainians are shooting at innocent, supposedly Moscow children. Well, you know, they'll keep parading that crucified boy story until the end of time. Until we actually hear from the Russians that American missiles have started being used, we can just assume that what we've been given so far are slingshots, and we've only been allowed to use them on Russian fields.
Roman Egorovich, well, we rarely talk about missile strikes, as you know. We mostly discuss drone attacks. I understand that the distance is, of course, quite short, which makes missile strikes possible, but the Neptune missile, this is official. It struck the Karachevsky Elektrodetal plant in Russia's Bryansk region. A fire broke out. At first, there was information that these were Ukrainian drones, but then, officially, it was reported that it was a Neptune missile strike. What do you think?
Well, the Karachinsky Elektrodetal plant had a Ukrainian Karachun in its dreams. We have a mountain called Karachun, it's interesting, and there are some aspects related to this Karachun that are relevant for Russians as well. So they carried out a strike. Finally, here is something we can really talk about specifically as an action. This concerns the production of Neptune missiles by the Luch Design Bureau. We have the Luch Design Bureau, which for several years now, for more than a decade, they have been modernizing the R-35 missile. Back in the Soviet Union, there was a very good R-35 missile and later the R-35U. It was mainly produced here. Our engine, our control system. In other words, it was our missile. The missile was air-to-ship. It was an anti-ship air-launched missile. So mainly it was used by fighter jets at the time. I even studied it back in my day. That was a very long time ago, over 40 years ago. So no. This old missile, based on this missile, since it was produced here, a 35U missile was developed with a greater range, about 70 kilometers up to 150 kilometers. Based on this missile, they took it off the plane. You could say they stole it and made it land-based. In other words, they created a launch platform. Neptune, the launcher, this is the coastal missile system Neptune, and it was originally produced as a missile no longer air-to-ship, but land-to-ship. So it was the same anti-ship missile, but launched from land. We produced several launchers, several of these control systems. We basically already have this Neptune. We've had this missile for quite a while. The Luch Design Bureau went even further. They repurposed the missile's guidance system to work not against ships, but against land targets. They introduced high-precision guidance systems there, and in fact, the guidance technology is ahead of the curve. You could say it's got machine vision and everything. It operates on the terminal phase, the final stage. As it approaches the target, it already uses machine vision. In other words, it's practically running artificial intelligence software. It can't be affected by electronic warfare, not at all. It no longer communicates with neither with satellites nor with ground systems. So the guys really did a great job working on this missile. Right now, the question is about the range of this missile. They've managed to extend its range to 300 kilometers for ground to ground. Now, the issue is achieving even greater range. So how do you make a missile with a longer range? If it has a good engine, you just need to increase the amount of fuel. The missile's center of gravity changes, it might become a bit larger. But in principle, technically, there's nothing complicated about it. It can be extended to ranges of 500 to 600 kilometers, and that's the distance to where Moscow is, and 600 to 700 is already Engels, meaning you can reach as far as the Volga. So that's what the Lush Design Bureau is working on right now, and they're doing it successfully. The only thing they're lacking is funding. They're throwing money around at anything and everything, on some missiles that they're trying to develop from scratch and trying to scale up some kind of production. But for now, it's just in videos and announcements. That's why I always say these announcers are getting on everyone's nerves. Enough with the endless announcements already. Pay up, get it done, provide the funding, and they'd be churning out those Neptunes like burgers. And our Neptunes would be working at a range of 300 to 400 kilometers to start with, just like they did, at least with that Elektrodetal target. 4 missiles hit, Elektrodetal was taken out. Zenyak Karachun came to me in a dream, to that Karakevsky or Karachunovsky Elektrodetal. So in other words, we can keep working further. There are opportunities. We are a rocket country. We have smart, skilled specialists. The main thing is to set the task, provide funding, and not interfere in the processes. No need to look for something there or insert your own middlemen, these pontificators or anything else. No need to look for your own cash gaps there. Just give people the money and they'll get it done. They can work it out on Russian targets, at least on nearby ones, meaning they can already handle operational targets. Here's a vivid example. Today, they're just great. First of all, it's the Navy. Besides the fact that the missile itself is produced by KB Lush, Lush is working with this missile, and it's a coastal missile system. To this day, it is considered to be operated by the Navy. The Navy has been credited for it. That's what it's called. A submarine surfaced in the steppes of Ukraine and struck with these Neptunes at the Russian steppes at this electrical component. In other words, our Navy is no longer just about ships. It has shifted to targeting land-based objectives, and that was the right move, because when it comes to accomplishing combat missions, all means are good. And a submarine in the steppes of Ukraine, believe me. This can inflict serious damage on Russian rear positions.
Roman Nikolaevich, you always say that it's much more effective for us to strike oil refineries and airfields with missiles, especially using ballistic ones. Now, we've just watched an example together. For instance, Neptune struck. In your opinion, how soon will we really be able to attack Russian military targets with ballistic and cruise missiles?
Well, Elektrodetal is also a military target because it's tied to the Russian. They mainly produce military equipment there, so it's purely a military facility since it's directly involved in the production process of military hardware, and that's why there's no need to hold back. This is a cruise missile, not a cruise missile site, but the Grom ballistic missile, which we're waiting for. We hear these announcements, watch the videos, no questions there, but there are no missiles. And as soon as there are enough ballistic missiles, how are they different from cruise missiles? The Russians have an air defense system that has been developed over 100 years, you could say, an aviation-related system created over a century. All the surface-to-air missile systems, all the man-portable air defense systems, all the mechanisms for destroying missiles and aircraft, they are mainly tuned against aerial targets, as they call them. That is, those that stay aloft in the air on wings. In other words, anything that takes to the air at any level. Thank you. It could be drones, it could be cruise missiles, it could be airplanes. Everything that flies according to the laws of aerodynamics. Against all of that, practically 100% of Russian air defense systems work. That's why it's very difficult for cruise missiles, drones, in other words, aerial targets, to break through. First, through the enemy's frontal air defense line, and then to the target itself, if that target is something like Moscow or the Kerch Peninsula. So, in this sense, for cruise missiles, the only hope is when it comes to operations in the near rear, at the operational level, there is still a chance to break through the frontal air defense line and hit a target that doesn't have its own dedicated defense group. But in reality, of course, a missile, especially a subsonic one, and most missiles are subsonic. There is one cruise missile that flies at supersonic speed, the KH-22. It's a terrifying missile that we once handed over to the Russians, and they've used them against us. It's truly supersonic, and it's very difficult to intercept, to take it down. But all other cruise missiles are an easy target for Russian air defense. A difficult target for Russian air defense is ballistic missiles. because almost all surface-to-air missile systems that work well against cruise missiles perform poorly against ballistic missiles, against things that come from space. First they go into space, then they fall back down from space. Especially the speeds in the final phase, as they approach the target, they're extremely high. In the hypersonic range, that is 3 to 5 Mach, is calculating the interception point is extremely difficult, even for Russian surface-to-air missile systems. That's why producing ballistic missiles is so important for us. And what's most interesting is that we used to produce them. Chrome is our missile. It has a range of 300 to 500 kilometers, which we are capable of achieving, just like the Neptune, around 300 to 400, maybe up to 500 kilometers, a cruise missile. For now, at the very least, we need to focus on this. And definitely, we're no longer in a position where we can just subtract like before when we already have to subtract. We had this missile, it should exist. It just needs to be funded. The middlemen need to be removed. The cash gaps need to be eliminated. And the pennies that corrupt officials insert into all these processes need to be taken out. And then the missile will go. We will see it again. And you and I will still be talking about how our ballistic missiles are striking Russia's military targets.
Roman Lvovich, after yet another massive missile and drone attack by Russia, right? 600 drones, almost 50 missiles. I was just on air, and military analysts on the broadcast voiced the opinion that if we were to strike strategic military airfields and drone bases with missiles on a permanent, ongoing basis, then we would simply be able to prevent these drone and missile attacks. But unfortunately, drones are not capable of inflicting such damage. Do you agree with this opinion?
Well, the thing is, yes, it would be better to just burn all of Russia, all 17 million square kilometers, pour diesel over it and set it on fire. And it would all burn down and everything would be lost. Well, theoretically, it's possible, but technically it's impossible. So yes, it would be good to strike at the launch sites. But what is a site? A launch site, let's say, for a drone, it's a vehicle. It's not just ground-based launchers, it's also mobile vehicles. But how are you going to track it down in the end? If you're going to strike at something, then it should be at the places where they're produced or stored. That is, if you're going to reach as far as Alabuga or Izhevsk or a Chinese factory that mainly produces the main components and assemblies, or the storage sites, meaning where these drones are stored. Because the launch points, they can change them 10 times a day. It's just unrealistic. Strike at the airfields, no questions about that. Of course, it's good to strike at airfields, but what's the issue? Take the Engels airfield, for example. What can actually reach it from our side at this point? And I'll tell you, nothing except drones. But those drones have to get through the frontline air defenses, and that's practically 5 Russian regions lined up along the border. They're packed with air defenses. That's Bryansk. That's Kursk, Belgorod, Voronezh, and Rostov. These regions, for several hundred kilometers deep, are saturated with air defenses. That's the Russian frontline air defense. Try breaking through that. And as for what does break through, let's say a few drones manage to get through. By the time they make it to Engels, they'll be rattling all the way. I say rattling on purpose because that's exactly what they do. They're powered by internal combustion engines. It takes them several hours. Their speed is about 150 kilometers per hour, a range of over 500 kilometers, more than 3 to 4 hours. That's how long it takes to get there. By that time, they'll already be pretty much ready to just shoot them down. So realistically, it's not possible to inflict damage on, say, airfields or military targets with drones. It's just not realistic, except for oil refineries. Oil refineries can be taken out. Even a single drone hitting the distillation tower can take out the entire oil refinery as long as the tower is gone. It can't be restored from scratch. Another place where drones can be used is the coastline. That's what I mean. This applies to Crimea, since the Russians can't cover themselves from the sea because we've driven their ships away. Ship-based air defense can provide cover, but if the ships have been driven away, it means you can approach Crimea. If you push the Russian ships further back into the base, then in principle, you can use drones against Novorossiysk, Sochi, Adler, and even along the Russian coastline. That's it. We can't use drones anywhere else. Well, based on the current capabilities, at least of Russian air defense at this moment. So missiles are needed, and with missiles, of course, you need long-range ones. Again, ballistic ones, because even to reach Tarakti or the same Alabuga, look, the missile travels, let's say it's flying at near supersonic speed, even if it accelerates to about 900 to 950 kilometers per hour. It will take more than an hour to reach Alabuga. At least several radar stations will track it. Russian ones, they'll scramble fighter jets, and the missile will simply be shot down by those fighters. They might not scramble fighters for drones, maybe they just don't want to risk the planes, but for a missile, they definitely will. If they see more, they'll definitely realize it's a missile based on its speed. It'll be obvious whether it's a drone buzzing along at 150 or a missile flying at 950, so even a cruise missile is hard to miss. So, we're waiting for ballistic missiles. That's what I'm talking about, what I want. Long-range ballistic missiles included. Yeah, well, when it comes to missile, solid fuel, can get you 500 to 600 kilometers. But to go beyond 1,000 kilometers, you need liquid fuel. That is for liquid fuel engines, which in principle we can produce, both solid fuel and liquid fuel engines. We have specialists. Again, it's a matter of setting the task, technical requirements, and funding. And of course, all this should be done by people who understand production. Not artists, not clowns, not kiosk owners for that matter, but specifically people with a military education who are well versed. Here you need two educations, a basic military one and at least a technical one related to the production of various types of equipment. And then in principle, these issues can be solved using our own resources. In that case, we don't need anyone else, meaning our partners. We can produce these missiles ourselves. We just need to replace the executive authorities. We've talked about this a million times. No elections, no re-elections, none of that. None of these political squabbles. It's just necessary to replace the executive branch with people who have a basic military and industrial education. There are plenty of such people. They just need to be brought in.
Roman Nikolaevich, SBU drones attacked and halted the operation of an oil pumping station in the Chuvash Republic of Russia. What do you have to say about that?
Well, now the kid's got a thing for the Chuvash. Before he was into Tatars, then Bashkirs, and now he's after Chuvashia. Well, such an undiscriminating or, on the contrary, overly picky leader. Well, of course, with that sarcasm, a kind sort of sarcasm. We all understand that perfectly well. Yeah, the SBU guys, well done. Real beauties. You see, they worked over Tatarstan, then Bashkortostan, took them out, and now they've reached Chuvashia and are starting to take out oil pumping stations. We're talking billions too, since we brought this up. What is an oil pumping station? 3 of them in a row. If you don't fall asleep on the pipeline, inside the pipe, the pressure will drop to 0. Well, not exactly 0, but atmospheric pressure, that's what I mean. So there won't be any pumping anymore. And it's possible and even necessary to stop Russian oil production, including by destroying these kinds of oil pumping stations. There's only one question. Here's my question for the targeters. Let me put it this way. I'll ask in military terms. Why the hell would you fly over 1,000 kilometers to take out some oil refinery or oil pumping station when just 50 kilometers away there's the Druzhba oil pipeline and there's an LPDS right there that's still pumping Russian oil further? What's the point of that? So that's the question. There's a pipeline lying right there, just north of us. That very same pipeline actually runs through Ukraine. You don't need to fly anywhere. You just need to turn the valve and forget about pumping $18 million a day. As for the pipeline in Chuvashia, what exactly it's pumping is a big question. And one oil refinery, or rather one pump, won't solve the problem. You need to lay at least 3 of them in a row. And they're right there, 50 kilometers away. You don't have to go far to get there. Just make a decision and get the job done. Or arrest under Article 111 for treason whoever forbade you from doing this. And this doesn't just concern Malyuk, it concerns Budanov, it concerns Madar as well. That is Siersky, in other words, the generals who fully understand that the pipeline, Druzhba pumps $18 million into the Russian treasury every day, 300,000 barrels of oil. That's what goes through this pipeline. But here's the most interesting part. The same SBU guys are sent on a mission. They went on a mission. They target the terminal, but the pipeline is the real target, the one that starts from Unecha. So why on earth did they have to go on that mission when they could have just gone to Unecha, 40 kilometers away, and taken out that pumping station? But honestly, I just don't get it at all. And to this day, no one has been arrested among those who are preventing this from happening. Roman Svitan.
The British Sun published to choke off, and Ukrainian drones are turning Russia's oil and gas empire into a hellish chain. Long-range drones from the SBU and defense forces are dealing a serious blow to the Russian economy by attacking its very heart, oil and gas industry facilities. According to The Sun, Ukraine has already inflicted about $100 billion in damages on Russia. Military intelligence expert Philip Ingren noted the effectiveness of using long-range drones, actions that target facilities at distances of over 1,000 kilometers, as you just mentioned. In September of this year alone, the SBU successfully struck Russian oil refineries and oil pumping stations 5 times. Deep inside the country, Gazprom Neftekim Salavat in Bashkortostan was hit twice. in Bashkortostan, one of the largest oil refining and petrochemical plants in Russia, which is located less than 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine. Roman Igorovich, what do you think?
What we've been saying for at least half a year now, the optimal way for us to win this war. Actually, it's not just optimal, it's the only way. There is simply no other option. The only way for us to defeat the Russian army is to destroy the Russian state by collapsing its economy, just like what happened with the Soviet Union. This has all been done before. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. It was invented long before us. All we have to do is get on and ride, as they say. So the way to bring down the Russian state is by collapsing its economy. What is the Russian Federation? And what, in the end, are these so-called Russian federalists? It's dozens of peoples and ethnic groups. It's 21 republics that make up the Russian Federation. They didn't play for a 22nd, remember? As we said, the amateurs weren't in the game. They took out Crimea as the 22nd, added it to the Russian constitution. That's overdoing it, folks. It's called losing everything. Like I said, they've got issues with the game. I mean, I was talking about the game. Don't get any wrong ideas. So Russia's main problem is exactly this, the economy. If you stop it, that is, stop the flow of petrodollars. The republics that are part of the Russian Federation, most of them, more than a dozen and a half, are subsidized from Moscow. So why are they all even part of the Russian Federation? Because Moscow redirects to them the petrodollars it gets from selling oil and gas. That's all there is to it. As soon as all of that stops, they'll scatter in all directions. And they'll scatter wherever they can, just like the 15 republics of the Soviet Union did back then. They're already prepared, they've got their skis ready, their suitcases are packed, and they already have their own governments. And by the way, some of these governments already exist. For example, we've recognized the English government, and Ukraine, by the way, has recognized the English Republic, the English people, and so on. And I think we'll continue to recognize more. In other words, that's the only mechanism by which the Russian army can be defeated. Why? What is an army? It's a derivative of the state. No state, no army. So that's the only way. Otherwise, you'd have to grind down 700,000 people and, well, let's put it mildly, sweat it out. The optimal way is through destroying Russia's oil industry, which has only been happening for the past 2 months. We've been talking about this with you for, about half a year now, saying that's how it should be done. 2 months of work and 100 billion just went down the drain. And what if we keep this up until the end of the year? That's it. The Russian economy will be gone. Nabulina, well, that's a whole other story, my dear. A Tatar woman, that's what I'm saying, hinting at. So Nabulina, she'll just print more money. For about a year, they'll keep the printing press running. And with those printed rubles, they'll manage to get by for another year. But by the end of 2026, that's it. So Nabulina will hang herself. The money she managed to get out for us were frozen, and now we're supposed to get them back. There are over 200 billion euros worth of these securities. By the way, they should put up a monument to Nabulina in Kyiv. Once she hangs herself, we'll put up a monument, because you don't put up monuments to people while they're alive. They'll put one up after she dies. That's the kind of mechanism that's leading to the collapse of the Russian Empire. It's already been set in motion, and now all the analysts are starting to talk about it. They finally opened their eyes. But how long have Dasha and I been saying this? We've been talking about it for half a year. Every broadcast, it's the most interesting topic. And now we're saying that this problem could be made even worse if the Druzhba oil pipeline is destroyed. And in every broadcast, we'll be asking, so what's up with Druzhba? Today, it pumped another $18 million again.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich, you say this in every broadcast, as they say, it's not us, it's the absolute truth. You always say it's a side effect. I completely understand that. The fuel crisis in Crimea continues. It's colossal. But from a military standpoint, can we take advantage of the fuel crisis in occupied Crimea, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, we need to understand what we're talking about. It's a fuel crisis for the civilian population. We can't take advantage of it in any way. This is a problem for the Russian occupation authorities. The negativity falls on Moscow naturally, and so on and so forth. For us, it's just a negative for Moscow, that's all. Again, all these Moscow types, all those not yet dead Kyosayans, meaning the wives of the Kyosayans, they still try to turn everything against us. We're supposedly doing something somewhere, somehow, but we're fighting, we really are fighting. So this is Moscow's problem. They seized Crimea, but for example, they can't provide for it. Crimea can't be supplied with fuel. Donbas can't be supplied with water. And most interestingly, Moscow can't supply itself with brains. Well, at least judging by these senseless actions, that's the minimum. So this really is a side effect. But as for a real, say, fuel crisis that could affect the Russian army, at this stage, that's impossible for one simple reason. Why did we spend 6 months saying every day that the Russian oil industry needed to be destroyed? It was so that the Russians wouldn't be able to prepare enough fuel for the Russian army. But they did prepare it. And those green profiteers who let them prepare it, not allowing our generals to destroy the oil industry. Over 6 months, they created a certain base for the Russian army to complete the summer military campaign. There's nothing we can do now. The Russian army is supplied with fuel for several months, thanks to the 6 months they spent stockpiling it. Because fuel in the army is distributed a bit differently. In other words, it's already been spread out in some directions. It's very difficult to single out all these depots now. That's the specificity of so-called army reserves. Even down to the last drop of gasoline, or rather diesel, for example, the tanks will take it from the tractor driver. Well, you understand yourself, unless they put a bottle there together and smash it. Whether they smash it or not, or whether they do, that's just how things are done among the Russians.
Dear audience, please like this video and write a few silly words in the comments to support our tandem and Ukraine's armed forces. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan, we do live streams 3 times a week on my YouTube channel. Roman Grigorievich, thank you, and as usual, see you this Wednesday.
Goodbye.